Good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We will get started. Apologies for the small delay. I see people trickling in, and we will get started in a minute or so. Thanks for your patience. All right, everyone. Good day. We are going to start. Um, Still waiting for our keynote, but he should be in shortly. So let me first welcome everyone to our online symposium, Science, Technology, and Innovation for Sustainable Post-Pandemic Recovery in U.S. Island Territories. This is the second time we're having this online symposium sponsored by the Oak Ridge Associated Universities. My name is Kaleem Shah. I'm assistant professor here at the Biden School, University of Delaware, and I also lead the very new Island Policy Lab, which has organized this event. If you're in the environment and climate change innovations for island session, then you're definitely in the right place. Okay, and again, apologies for the short delay. I want to just reach out and say um, welcome to especially our Pacific region colleagues who have joined us in this session. This time, it's a little bit more palatable time for you guys, although several folks from that region also joined us for the earlier panels, which I very much appreciate. So I did want to acknowledge that. So with that being said, um, a little bit about the Island Policy Lab. We are a relatively new unit, research group here dedicated to leveraging scientific evidence, data, and new analytical tools to identify and implement practical policy solutions to the many often unique challenges of island geographies and island jurisdictions globally. And this year, the theme is looking at giving a focus to those U.S. Overseas islands territories, because in the context of U.S. domestic policy and even U.S. international policy, we do want to ensure and reinforce sort of the place of these U.S. island territories in those conversations. And I know this is nothing new to the experts on our panel this evening, and this is what they do. But I do want to make sure and emphasize that point that um, the island territory is often, spoken about, especially, in international development terms, as sort of the peripheral areas, right? But we want to have this space where islands are not peripheral areas. Islands are central and foremost to the discussions. And indeed, on issues of environment and climate change, um, islands have played sort of an outsized role so far, and we want to ensure and make sure that continues to be like that. So that's what we will focus on in our panel today. Just to sort of add to that, in my we just in the last couple of days, last week or so, we've had the new IPCC report come out, which is very telling. The forecasts are extremely telling. Um, I am currently going through the reports now, but in a previous draft iteration, so with my other hats and my capacity as the coordinator for the United Nations Consortium of Small Island Universities, which is an official multi-stakeholder representative in the process. We were able to provide some comments on earlier drafts, which were well taken. But pretty much what we're seeing here are that many observed impacts of climate change are happening far more quickly than previously predicted. And naturally, this is magnified and accentuated many times over in our island geographies. We're also being told that the business as usual approach will probably lead and will actually definitely highly likely lead to beyond 2 degrees C warming, well beyond that target. So we're in a situation here when we talk about island communities, we're in a situation where we are looking to scale up fast-paced adaptation and resilience building in a significant way, more so than before. One of the points of the report as well, which I think is really important, is that there are solutions available. There are solutions that are actively being looked at. There are solutions that are available. But as we all know, getting from that point A to point B, there's a lot of intervening factors in there, right? Political will, socio-cultural considerations, economic and financing considerations, and so on. So while we see that clear link, and we do have this impetus for action, sort of those intervening factors can be quite significant, especially in our island communities. Today in this session, we also would like to touch on sort of understanding many of the other environmental impacts in islands. We have from the solid waste, from the plastic pollution issues that have become very prominent and significant in recent years. We also had a recent IPBES report looking at biodiversity losses, unique biodiversities in isolated island territories as well. So there's a number of issues that overlay themselves in very complex ways. And of course, sort of beyond that, or beyond that is not maybe the right word, but sort of intrinsic to that is the fact that we have to make adjustments and meet these challenges, find these innovative solutions, and implement them in ways that are equitable and just to these island communities. Just in terms of sustainable economic growth, opportunity, quality of life for the island communities. Foundational to that, and I'm sure our speakers will also mention, foundational to that, are always the lack of and the deficiencies in information, data for decision making, that evidence-based approach to policy making and decision making that comes up time and time again. But notwithstanding that, as I always say, so sort of we need to make the best decisions that we can, the most optimal decision that we can right now with data that is not optimal, and we need to be able to have the flexibility to move forward, but also adjust course as more data and information and scientific knowledge becomes evident. We're also seeing sort of the theme here was sort of post-pandemic. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we are moving forward from there. We have sort of the um, always going issue now of in island regions, Pacific and the Caribbean, African Ocean, elsewhere, extreme weather, and based on many discussions we had in earlier sessions today on energy and economic recovery with the other panels, we quickly see that even things like the current situation, terrible situation in Europe, will have ripple effects, repercussions, even into island territories. Just recently, a couple of days ago, I was looking at in my own home country, Trinidad and Tobago, reports in the newspapers there about repercussions to food security in many islands, especially if commodity products like wheat and flour and so on, the prices raised. And these are trickle effects based on a lot of what's happening in European markets. If we look at energy security issues, that's a whole other kettle of fish, which also becomes quite relevant. But let me stop there, and I'm sure that our panel will take up many of these and more issues in more detail. I want to now introduce to you our keynote speaker for this evening's session, Dr. Roger Pulwarty. Roger is the senior scientist and director at the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Roger has been a strong supporter and friend of developing the Island Policy Lab, and personally my work as well here for some time. I feel that Roger was a little bit surprised when I called him and asked him to be here, simply because we find each other in so many Zoom rooms so many times, and I've heard him speak quite vocally about these issues forcefully before. But hopefully it wasn't so much of a surprise. And Roger's response was, to me, was, Kaleem, tell me what you need. I'm very grateful for him to say that. If I had my thinking cap on more quickly, I would not have asked him to be keynote. I would have asked him for $1 million in federal grants. But nevertheless, we're very happy to have him here today, pull him from his busy schedule. So with that, let me hand the floor to Dr. Roger Pulwarty for the keynote. Roger?
Great, thanks very much. And your response on the $1 million, Callum, showed quite clearly why thinking quickly but making the wrong decision is not decisive. So I appreciate that you didn't ask for the $1 million to start with. So let me see if I can share my screen here and get us on the way. We have some really good speakers lined up. So let me know if this is showing up effectively. And I will give some background to what we're doing. Let me see if I can get us on here. Can you let me know if that screen is being shared?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the Caribbean, and I'm from the same island as Callum, actually. Very adaptive and very musical, very culturally rich, as many islands are. And in my role in NOAA, I lead a lot of work on extremes and risks. And so let's get a sense of what some of these things are. And then very much to Callum's point, these issues about surprises, tipping points, and so on in the system. And as we think through islands, and you're going to hear certainly about the Pacific from Victoria Aquina, a close colleague in other NOAA projects and activities, I'm just going to give a sense of what we've been learning about islands in general, what we've known for a long time, and then what it means for the Caribbean, focusing on the US territories, that being the focus of the project for the center at the moment. So who is at risk? What is at risk? What is and what can be done about it? And of course, that filters into the issues of equity, better use of information, just decisions. But it is in the context of low probability events, some of them uncharacterized, some of them even unknown. So let's think through what this means for us. The IPCC report, I've been on several of these IPCC things, talked about islands. And this is what's been learning. That special report on extremes came out in 2012. Morphology, ecosystems and natural resources, impacts on island livelihoods, decreases in fish production, losses in commercial agriculture, things we can map and produce indicators for, impacts on settlements and infrastructure, the structural notion of what constitutes resilience. But as we're going to make the point that resilience is about infrastructure, built, green, social, and cultural. There's no such thing as really resilient infrastructure without resilient people. And as we think through this, we're going to ask the question, are our assumptions borne out by what we know about the climate system? So this figure is from the just released report. I was on the US delegation that did the approval on this from 2 weeks ago, Climate Change 2022. So stretching from the special report on extremes to the sixth assessment that you just saw has been a little bit of an evolution in thought. A section in the 22 report says more about enablers, limits, and barriers. We didn't just wake up and realize that that was important. It was the idea of saying 1.5 degrees was actually already critical for island environments, not should we stop there. And then going back to the issue of extremes and linking how we plan in the present, disaster risk reduction with long-term climate adaptation, how to treat that as a continuum. So this is meant to really show not just an evolution in learning, but a thinking across scales that in fact enabling capabilities are extremely critical, thresholds and risks are extremely important. And exactly as Callum was saying, systemic risks, the drivers that are globally networked, whether it's food production. During the 1990s, when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida and there was the Loma Prieta earthquake in California, insurance premiums actually went up in the Caribbean, even though we did not have major hurricanes at the time, showing the way in which risk, and you heard a little bit about wheat and so on, is spread around the world, the globally networked risks that produce systemic impacts. So that's been an evolution in thought, but less an evolution in thought. We knew that to begin with. We're just putting together more data behind understanding governance and what it means to be climate resilient. In doing that, there have been several reports that have been released, and some of them I've been engaged in, some of them are led by people very, very closely embedded in the University of the West Indies or Puerto Rico, and NGOs and others on the region itself. And these are focused mainly on the US, Puerto Rico, and a little less so on the US Virgin Islands. The fourth National Climate Assessment, you'll hear a bit from Dr. Kina, myself. I'm going to speak to what some of those results were. We're in the middle of drafting the Caribbean chapter for this fifth National Assessment. And just last year, to Callum's point about drivers that are connected globally that impact local imbalances, we released a report from the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction on how COVID-19 responses were in fact impacting the region's capability to effectively do disaster risk reduction, and even more so to implement climate change adaptation. And I'm going to come back to what that means in terms of infrastructure, networks, and so on. So just to remind us, not only are the islands different, within islands, there's differences. And so we go from corals and places in which sediment is actually accreting to other places in which sediment is basically being lost and where coasts are changing rapidly and dynamically over time. I also teach at the University of the West Indies in Barbados. You can see some pictures from Barbados there, very much engaged. But these reports are actually feeding into how we're thinking through integrated coastal zone management, and the broader regional capabilities in the Caribbean. And I'm not holding that up as a particular reifying a particular approach. I'm just saying people have been trying to adapt and adjust to the risks over time. What I'm going to show is basically, in some cases, our assumptions behind even our best engineered plans are actually not taking enough into account. And one of those figures I like to show in this context is this classic figure we did in the National Academy report that shows for just one event, one type of event, severe convective storms or wildfires driven by dryness and so on, or tropical cyclones or droughts, the idea that yes, we understand something about them, but we don't understand everything. Even our projections, the things we do in IPCC, the integrated assessment models, very good for comparing what we should do on emissions, but much less so in understanding these extreme events and how society responds to them. One of my mentors, a gentleman by the name of Gilbert White, always asks the question, if we know so much, why aren't we doing better? And in this context, and trying to predict and think about those types of events in the context of a changing climate. There's the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, one of the busiest on record. Right now, we're doing some work with Central America and the Caribbean and what that means and how that's impacting migration and food security. And also drought conditions going at the same time. So it's not, of course, responding to a hurricane or responding to sea level rise or responding to drought, but the multiplicity of hazards. And as we all know, a hazard does not become a disaster until it overwhelms people's capability to respond. So as we begin to understand this, there's not 100% understanding of anything. We know something about heat and we know something about cold, and there's usable information, even down to severe convective storms. But there's also immense uncertainty. And the idea is not to throw our hands up at that, but say, what is usable for planning? What can we do prospectively, plan in terms of potential surprises? And how do we get those things on the ground? So here's the case of Puerto Rico in 2017. This is what we call a focusing event. This actually changed the way we think about globally networked risk and about systemic risk, how things filter in through economies, networks, and society. In 2017, 22 of 29 Caribbean SIDS were impacted, 4 were impacted by one storm, 13 by 2 storms. And I grew up in the Caribbean. If you hear one storm is coming, you're in panic. If you hear 13 by 2 storms, that's a whole other thing. So from some really good work, Kishore, Solomon Chang, and others, it was pretty clear that it was really the loss of basic utilities that produced a lot of impacts, right? And we know this disruption of medical services took 125 days almost for water to come back online, cell coverage, electricity. And to keep the systemic risk in mind, that is, yet it is about infrastructure, but it is in fact more so about the networks that support those infrastructure. 2017, because of Maria and Irma, were critical system failures, which caused evacuation and displacement, and in some cases, migration, closures, and reduced services for extended periods of time. So these filter into and through much longer, of course, than the emergency response, and much longer than a lot of recovery windows allow us to act in. So there's the Puerto Rico and US Virgin Islands observed and projected sea level rise. That's actually what was happening if you look at basically the blue areas and so on, as a result of a combination of wave height and Hurricane Maria on the north coast of Puerto Rico. And my reason for showing this is to give the indication that yes, there are nonlinear changes that are occurring. Some of them predictable, some of them we can measure and produce the design criteria for, and some of them are outside how we think about design criteria. In other words, they require an upfront cost for adaptation. And it's working out that kind of estimate so that it becomes critical. But something else also happened, which was from 2013 to 2016, prior to that very, very impactful year of 2017, we saw the most extensive drought since we've been keeping careful measurements post-war. In the Caribbean, a multi-year drought was the most severe and extensive since 1950. We saw food shortages everywhere. It extended from northern Venezuela up into the covering Puerto Rico and other places. In fact, that was the time we helped Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands develop their drought monitor. And in fact, precipitated some food security related migration in addition to the political issues from Venezuela into the Caribbean region. This drove a lot of awareness of food insecurity. We also estimated at the time that the amount of water a place like Jamaica uses at the peak of the tourism season was 10 times the amount it was getting from rainfall, drawing more heavily from groundwater, which was then also being impacted by sea level rise and saltwater intrusion. So we're dealing with a complex world here in which we cannot just say, okay, how do we plan for 2017 type event, or how do we plan for 2013 to 2016? And whenever one of the news outlets or whoever says, oh, we in a new normal, I said, there's no such thing. We're in a new abnormal in which we don't know the distributions of the different events over time, but we understand something about their drivers and how we might be able to respond. So most critically, and you'll hear this, I'm sure, from Victoria as well, everyone, tells us, yeah, hurricanes, man, that's what you deal with in the Caribbean. It affects tourism, it affects all this stuff. It's really water. The extremes of water, dry and flooding. And as I pointed out, the biggest impact we have is during the tourism season when there's actually a series of water shortages throughout many of the islands. And in fact, changes in the stream flow decline over time. There's the projected precipitation. Those are negative numbers as they get darker brown. And there's the other higher emission scenarios, the declining stream flow in Puerto Rico from 2040 to 2060. Once again, I'm saying that these are indicators over time. These are not predictions, right? Integrated assessment models give you a sense, scenario over time, not necessarily a prediction. So in fact, the case I'm making is that when you combine extremes on top of these projections, you have surprises, tipping points, and thresholds in the system. So a series of scenarios that were developed through the University of the West Indies with colleagues and that I have there at Water and elsewhere. For RCP 2.6 and others, we called it cool runnings. You still have moderate growth, consumers and energy mix. 2.6, SSP2, renewable energy is put into place. We're still islands in the sun, one love. Then it begins to get into thresholds in which we're actually seeing things that begin to surprise us. The harder they come, and Pirates of the Caribbean. This area is completely dependent on what Colin was saying, whether or not around the world we see global economic disruptions driven by war, food security impacts in other parts of the world, multiple failures of food baskets, and so on. So how do we move, and how have we been trying to move from planning to implementation, the integration of economies, communities, environments, for putting the pieces together? One of the things we've tried to do, and this is through the State Department with efforts through NOAA and elsewhere, is develop something called the Early Warning Information Across Climate Timescales. This is a partnership with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. And there's the director in the second picture, wearing, his head looking at the minister signing the agreement, David Farrell. Absolutely effective public individual. This group joined the Caribbean Public Health Organization, CIMH itself, insurers, the Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility. And we can show very clearly how having this early warning information across climate timescales, working with people on the ground, actually prevented loss of life during 2017, actually helped during 2020, and in fact allow for quicker recovery after those events. So there's some clear things about early warning, but they have to be across climate timescales. And what I mean, I'll get back to what I mean by that. Another thing that we've been engaged in over time is actually the development of vulnerability and adaptation efforts through the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. We had helped them develop their vulnerability and capacity assessment, joining with the University of the West Indies, a series of efforts throughout the region focused on community vulnerability, the introduction of photovoltaic systems. Most of Barbados now, their water systems are actually heated through solar power. But how we bring those up to scale are a big part of the challenges of the environment in the region. One example of this is on Bequia and Grenada, where solar-powered reverse osmosis systems were put in, promoting implementation of some specific adaptation and interventions, and then places in like Grenada, where we've actually, the 5Cs and others have actually helped them develop movable solar-powered panels that you can move into protected areas when a storm is coming. Another aspect, and this is from Austin Becker's work around the region that I've been trying to do, is get a map, a geospatial inventory of where the critical coastal infrastructure lies. And you can see a lot of them are related to informal settlements in different parts of these islands. Following on all of that has been a landmark set of activities in the country of Dominica. And we have the entire plan on how they're trying to do this. But what Colin was pointing to is the upfront, XCD is Eastern Caribbean dollars, the upfront investments that have to take place in order to get us past the initial hurdles of basically implementing and recovering after disaster. Get us out of not just being proactive, but prospective, not allowing new or new risks to arise. And that financing gap is one of the most critical that we have. We call it the sovereign liquidity gap, the gap between responding to an event and what is actually needed for long-term adaptation and resilience. So in that setting, and the printing, for some reason in the translation, the letters were much more dynamic than this. We've been working with the national security groups around the region and others to try to get a sense of how the interaction of migration, the ecosystem, the environmental systems of hurricanes, droughts, and floods are interacting with governance to give us a sense of where the entry points for acting are on coastal populations, migration, interregional displacement, and how they change over time. So what I'm saying is we're moving, and this could be true of other island regions as we look at the reports from around the world, from the unfamiliar to the unprecedented. This is actually the case. This is in the data. But there are things that we're doing over time. A simple way of thinking about this that we put it together in the special report from extremes years ago was there a simple risk? How do we respond to an event affecting a building, the design criteria, how the Saffir-Simpson scale on hurricanes are made relative to building structure. Complicated risks, the vulnerabilities associated with the people who are dependent and interact with that infrastructure and how new interventions actually impact them. Into the realm of complex compounding and cascading risks, hurricanes preceded by drought, both of them interacting with people's jobs, livelihoods, and foods, and then international issues surrounding trade and commodities. And along comes something like COVID-19, not at all necessarily related to climate, that undermines all of those capabilities. That's in the realm of systemic or complex compounding and cascading risk. So what do? We have to recognize the traditional risk assessment approaches are increasingly challenged by the nature of these evolving social conditions and vulnerabilities. We have to address the systemic risk governance for disaster by broadening the actor network. And one of those ways in which we do it is we identify who in the region can help support actions in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico in research and governance, financial institutions, leveraging the regional capabilities, and to do exactly what Callum was speaking to, engaging in budgetary alignment and support, broad-based awareness of vulnerability by doing the work behind it, the nature of technical capacity, and getting the upfront buy-in for acting. And that has been a deliberate effort throughout the region. We have one leader who is one of my heroes in the region, Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados, who said very, very clearly at the COP, COVID-19 has taught us that there's no national solution to a global problem, that in fact, we do have to handle the systemic risk globally, down to locally and back up. One of the most important things, and I'll wrap up here, and I am wrapping up, Callum. I know I said that to give you some encouragement that I'm indeed doing that, is this. One of the things we did starting in 2003 was develop a cadre and a critical mass of people, the role of academia in creating those policy and norm entrepreneurs who keep the system in mind while working on the critical nodes of communication, giving voice to local people and helping bring to bear their voices and things like the Regional Outlook Forum. They have voice, where are they being heard? And we've developed over 120 of these throughout the Caribbean region. And when folks ask me, oh, we've done all this stuff in DRR and IPCC, this is the most important thing. The network and a cadre of well-trained professionals to work on this interface between science, policy, and decision-making, and to make sure that that is a virtuous cycle. And that's, I think, a key area that academia can play in the setting, and the University of the West Indies is doing that. So these are partners in the region with whom we work. I put the Department of State there because I promised to mention a few things as the Caribbean Disaster Resilience Partnership is being developed. We have really strong links with the University of the West Indies on supporting and funding fellowships, also with the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology on their Regional Climate Outlook Forum. And then a larger effort being developed through the National Security Council and others on energy and resilience. So there's my introduction to the Caribbean with an umbrella of island vulnerability over it. So thank you, Colin, and thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, Roger. A lot of food for thought there. We need to digest much of that. I would just sort of also echo, you know, hurricanes, they don't recognize legal jurisdictions. They don't recognize exclusive economic zones. So it's very telling that the NOAA and your work with your colleagues addresses not just the U.S. Caribbean, but the acknowledgement that we in a common area, the wider Caribbean region, experiencing similar risks, impacts. There are lessons to be learned across borders, and this is very important work.
And the leveraging of capabilities. So yeah.
Exactly. And I think that is a wonderful sort of segue into the start of our panel, where we will have to speak to us first, Dr. Victoria Keener, Senior Fellow at the East-West Center. And it's a nice segue, I say, because my sort of first understanding of Dr. Keener's work some years ago was on the Pacific RISA program and that wonderful capabilities networking that she and her team did in the Pacific region. And I had always, wanted to figure out, one of the things I wanted to figure out from that work that she did was if there can be South-South cooperation and sort of mapping out these networks between not just the Pacific network, but the Caribbean Pacific network, so to speak. But you know, that is just one of the many, many important projects that Dr. Keener has worked on. And I think it might be complementary for her to speak now, as Roger mentioned, much of the US Caribbean, for her focus on the Pacific region. So with that, let me give the floor to Dr. Keener. Victoria?
Thank you, Callum, and I will share my screen. All right, are you seeing my presentation?
Yes.
Great. It's always, after 2 years of this, even now, it's a little bit stressful every time to know which of the many screens on the wall you end up sharing. But anyway, thank you so much for this invitation to speak today at this Innovation in Islands event. I'm very interested to hear remarks from the rest of the panel, as well as I'm very happy to go after Roger set the stage so nicely. Good to see you again, Roger. So today, I know that Roger promised I was going to be speaking about a couple of things, but I'm actually not going to talk as much about a lot of the climate projections and technical issues like that, as I am going to address the issue of climate security in the Pacific Islands region, the role of boundary organizations, so organizations like my research group that cross that climate science and policy boundary to work between the worlds, and kind of the role that we can play in advancing some of these ideas, specifically around climate innovation and the kind of environmental and security space. So, so today I'm going to speak about kind of climate boundary organizations in general and specifically in the Pacific Islands. I'm going to very briefly outline some key climate and environmental security threats in the region. And then I'm going to give 2 examples of kind of innovative projects that we've done across the region that look at building some adaptive responses and linking some of the climate stressors and shocks with responses. So just very briefly, I know that Austin will be speaking later on the panel, and I'm sure he will show some Pacific maps as well. But this is the geographical scope of the region I'll be concentrating on today. So for our purposes, I'll be concentrating on Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands, which are comprised of the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, the Republic of Palau, and the territories of Guam and American Samoa. So it's a very vast region, has a lot of diverse geographies, varied governance and socioeconomic conditions. The presence of the US military across the region is of course a factor. Climate data monitoring and modeling that is available vary across the region as well. So for example, there is a US state, US territories, both organized and unorganized, Commonwealth and freely associated states that operate under the Compact of Free Association, or the COFA, which is being renegotiated imminently, or if it's not already starting, with the US government. There are colonial histories throughout the region. So there's US, British, and French colonial histories, which affect how different populations have been made more vulnerable to climate impacts. There's a wide geographic scope, a wide range of elevations from atoll nations to volcanic islands like Hawaii that are still very, very high in elevation, over 13,000 feet, a wide range of per capita incomes, both military installations, new US Marine National Monuments, and as I said, a wide variety of data available. So what I'm going to be speaking about today at first is boundary organizations and the role they can play. And the one I work with specifically and co-lead is the Pacific RISA, which is a NOAA Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment Team. And here's just kind of a rainbow of logos of different groups that have been involved over the years with the RISA. But in terms of what a climate boundary organization does, so it lacks a consistent single definition. It doesn't come with a way of how to implement or guide the creation of a boundary organization. And it's really up to an organization itself to interpret and actualize that. So really they serve as a crucial link in generating credible and trusted science that's relevant to local adaptation and mitigation decisions. These organizations can serve as a link between researchers, community members, and policymakers, and hopefully a way that's beneficial to all groups, and is going to be increasingly critical in facilitating those solutions to different aspects of the climate crisis. So the Pacific RISA, the research group I co-lead, is one of these organizations, and I'm going to provide two examples of regional engagement on climate adaptation and kind of that security space as we go forward. And just some other types of boundary organizations Roger touched on as well are, the IPCC. Austin will talk about groups he's involved with in Guam and throughout the region as well. And I think they're really critical as we move forward. So just to touch on the importance of climate security in the region as well. So in 2013, old news by now, former commander of US Pacific Command, Admiral Samuel Locklear, called climate change the greatest security threat to the Pacific region. So there's some key climate threats to environmental security. Many of these are very similar to what you already heard from Roger in the Caribbean. Some of these include rising average and minimum nighttime air temperatures, sea level rise, coastal erosion, changing freshwater supplies, impacts of long-term and severe drought, increasing storm intensity and movement of storm tracks throughout the region, a variety of ocean impacts, warming ocean temperatures, coral bleaching, shifting locations and types of pelagic fisheries, multi-causal climate-induced migration. So the list really goes on as Roger noted, and I've put a figure in from, this was the fourth National Climate Assessment chapter that I led, and like Roger, we're working on the fifth National Climate Assessment Pacific Islands chapter. Right now, I believe we just submitted our first order draft, but there's still a lot of time to be involved if you'd like to comment on the draft. And this is a nice figure that really distinguishes between climate indicators, so those technical variables, and climate impacts, are the responses we see on the ground. I'll also note that in terms of climate security, In October of 2021, the DoD released, along with a lot of other federal agencies, their climate risk analysis report. So I didn't put a link there, but you can just Google it. So that kind of outlines the way that DoD is starting to look at climate risk analysis on a bunch of different fronts. It is only an 18-page document, I believe, which is a rare thing to come out of DoD, an 18-page report. So I'm sure there's a lot more to come. The first project I'm going to talk about is to do with climate services for the Marshall Islands health sector, to do with climate migration and health impacts. So when we were doing research on climate-induced migration from the Republic of the Marshall Islands, health came up as one of the most significant variables that are impacting people's decision to leave. And these health decisions are intricately tied to climate in the country and throughout the region. So this project looks at identifying those links and how to mitigate the climate and health impacts. We're about to put out a comprehensive report on a lot of these findings. So I'll steer Colin to that publication when it comes out. So in 2019, Dr. Kasai, the WPRO regional director, said that climate change was one of the top 3 threats to Pacific Islands health. So there are both mental and physical health impacts from climate change in the islands that range from direct exposures like injuries from natural disasters and to indirect impacts like changes in vector-borne and waterborne diseases. And as we're finding, mental health impacts, which are critically understudied and not well understood. So that is a big gap that we're actually identifying in our national climate assessment right now. So in a WHO and RMI Ministry of Health led project, some of the climate related health concerns that were noted include diarrheal disease, malnutrition, vector-borne diseases, ciguatera or fish poisoning, mental health impacts, respiratory diseases, non-communicable diseases such as diabetes, injuries and death from extreme weather, and other diseases such as eye disease and skin disease, which commonly follow El Nino-induced droughts in the Western Pacific. And there's a nice figure there of that linking together. And what we see in the region is that as low rainfall and low sea levels happen during El Nino events, that leads to scarce drinking water, which can lead to increases in diarrheal disease, conjunctivitis, influenza. On the other hand, during La Nina, when there's above average rainfall and higher sea levels, leads to flooding and inundation, and an increase in vector-borne diseases and fish poisoning, ciguatera. And as Roger also noted, that confluence of extreme events, tropical cyclones and coral bleaching, for example, cause food scarcity and food insecurity, leading to malnutrition and increased dependence on imported food, which can increase NCDs like diabetes. So this project really wanted to look at how climate variability and change impact migration and health outcomes in the RMI and in Hawaii, one of the destination sites. So the Marshallese are experiencing climate-related health impacts associated with a lot of these different things: drought, sea level rise, heat stress, extreme events. And the RMI healthcare systems are under-resourced and unprepared to confront these impacts. You know, as a kind of bright spot, we have seen during the pandemic over the last couple of years that Pacific Islands have been very resilient at keeping their health systems able to confront the amounts of disease and keeping out COVID for a very long time until the vaccines were able to be delivered. But the movement of people from RMI to Hawaii has impacts on both sending and receiving locations. So can we improve the health sector access to information about the impacts of climate change and increase adaptive capacity in both areas to reduce climate-induced health risks? What we did, there's a need to identify those health sector needs. In a couple of different ways we've done that. We've used case studies to build capacity in different populations of health professionals to respond. So this was done with interviews and identifying decisions that could be that could benefit from climate information that's already available in 6 months forecast and increasing projections. And so this is still in progress, but there again, like I noted, there's some really interesting results coming out in a report soon about really looking at variables that were most important in determining how different populations in RMI experience climate impacts. And a lot of that is inequality in experiencing those impacts. So ownership of land, ability to migrate, having relatives in the US already. But I'll refer you to the report on that. So for the second case study, I wanted to talk about a study we did under CERDIP funding from the DoD, which was a freshwater study looking at impacts and adaptive responses to climate change for both the Department of Defense installations in Guam and the government of Guam and the territorial water utility as well. So we worked with both civilian, military, government stakeholders, and they're really starting to be used now in the consideration of freshwater management across the territory and in legislation. So the aim of this project was to better understand how a changing climate affected freshwater resources and environmental security in really integrated freshwater management on Guam. So we had climate modelers, hydrologists, and decision scientists who worked in collaboration with the Navy, the Guam Governor's Office, the Waterworks Authority to provide plausible scenarios of freshwater management under projected climate change under drought conditions, increased heat, and fewer but more intense typhoons. So with the climate projections that we did, so these are for 2080 to 2099, and this was back using RTP 8.5, what they call the business as usual scenario. Now there are updated climate projections as well. But what we saw was that annual air temperatures projected to rise. There's an increase in very hot days to over 257 days a year. Projected average annual change in rainfall about 7% less, and increased drought. An example result is shown here on the map of the well field in northern Guam. And so the dots on this figure show changes in saltiness in groundwater wells, and the size of the dot indicates greater saltiness under different climate scenarios. So we found that increased pumping, sea level rise, and decreased recharge in a future climate have compound effects that increase the salinity of that groundwater, but that the number of impacted wells could be reduced by selectively reducing the depth and withdrawal rates near that freshwater and saltwater transition zone. Stakeholders that we talked to also said it was critical to increase awareness and knowledge among community leaders and members about how systems may be impacted by climate change. So we did a lot of outreach as well. Finally, along the same collaborative lines, I wanted to talk about how regional climate networks and indeed global island climate networks can strengthen meaningful collaboration and adaptation. So my group also leads an open organization called the PERCA, or the Pacific Islands Regional Climate Assessment, which is a transparent and inclusive project that creates a sustained process to provide the most up-to-date and vetted climate knowledge and impacts by synthesizing scientific research with expert input from managers and agencies on the islands that are doing this work. This also provides a direct pathway to communicate key adaptation needs up to the federal level, and these are directly integrated into products such as the National Climate Assessment. But we have a series of new PERCA reports for CNMI, Guam, Palau, and American Samoa that have been released recently that are available at this website, and Marshall Islands and FSM are forthcoming. So finally, I guess to wrap up, my three main points would be that within the region, addressing the impacts of climate change is a repeatedly stated first priority across the Pacific, and that meaningful engagement and relationships with Pacific Islanders are critical for successful adaptation responses, and that collaboration on these regional climate and environmental issues has tended to transcend political disagreements for now, which is really showing the importance of that large scale. And with that, I will turn it back to Callum. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kina. Appreciate that. I'm cognizant of the time. So I do want to move forward, but very quickly, immediately from the project examples that you cite, there's a significant emphasis on multidisciplinary problem solving, which is well taken. Excellent examples. With respect to the PERCA reports that you just showed there, I was wondering where the communication of these reports is pitched to. Is it the general public? Is it students? Um, how do you see that?
Yeah, so we've tried to make them at a very accessible level. So it's definitely not for technical experts. And those PERCA reports, they break out the impacts by sector, as defined by which sectors are most important to decision makers on the ground in these islands. So public health sector, education sector, disaster response, freshwater ecosystems, even what to do as a community member and how to prepare your family. So it's really, they're pitched to a wide audience of decision makers, communities, and they've been used in several trackable ways thus far to propose new legislation, for example, to prepare freshwater resources for the impacts of climate. They've been used to support national adaptation plan formation as a main source. They've also been cited in the draft Insular Climate Change Act as a resource to provide more monitoring and resource funding to US insular areas. So it's really a wide range of stakeholders, but really at that very applied level across different sectors. And I can throw a link in the chat.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Great. And I should mention as well to the audience members that the presentations will be available on the Island Policy Lab site. These sessions are also recorded and will be available as well. So moving on our panel to our next speaker, we have Dr. Austin Shelton. He is Assistant Professor of Extension and Outreach and Director of the Center for Island Sustainability at the University of Guam. I would mention that, some time ago, about 2 years ago, when I met Austin, and I mentioned to him that I really have this intention to bring this research group, the Island Policy Lab, to fruition here at the University of Delaware. And he was very supportive at that time and shared a lot of the ideas and definitely some of the successes that his center at the University of Guam has had. So we do feel like we have a special relationship with Dr. Shelton and his center. His center has been at the forefront of a lot of community level work and work with local government, local NGOs, local groups in Guam. So I'm hoping that in his talk, he can bring some of that perspective and also give some response from the ground, from the position of Guam as a Pacific state, and some of the response to some of the ideas thrown out by Roger and Victoria. So with that, Austin Shelton.
Thank you very much, Kaleem, and thank you for having me here today. While I'm getting my screen up, I just want to say thank you to the last two presenters as well. It was really interesting to learn about Roger's work in the Caribbean. And also, we're always thankful for Dr. Keener's work at Pacific RISA and all of the valuable reports and data that they share with us here in the Pacific Islands. And so we look at that carefully, and it helps inform our actions here on the ground to help prepare and create a more resilient island to the impacts of climate change. So here's where we sit in the Pacific, and it was also on Victoria's map. Guam is in the Western Pacific region. We're actually a 7.5-hour flight west of Hawaii, and we're about 3.5 hours from Japan. So we're much closer to the Asia side of the Pacific. Now, just to show you, Victoria had some great in-depth examples of the impacts of climate change, but just some broad overview things about our region. This is what some of the climate impacts are looking like on the ground. We're having rising sea level, which will leave our low-lying atoll neighbors inundated with water for more than 24 hours at a time, causing frequent evacuations during these high tide events. We also have rising sea surface temperatures, which are bleaching our coral reefs and this essential fish habitat. We have lost over 1/3 of our coral reefs in Guam in recent years. And we're also experiencing more frequent and intense storms in the area. Fortunately, Guam has been missed by direct impact in recent years, but these are always brewing in our area more frequently and more intense than we would wish for. Now, here at the Center for Island Sustainability, we were established in 2009 to lead and support the transition of our island region toward a sustainable future. And I'm really happy to be speaking with Kaleem at the Island Policy Lab there at the University of Delaware. And we hope to have more interactions and collaborations going forward to connect what we're doing here in the Pacific with all of Kaleem's colleagues there in the Caribbean. Now, I'm just going to share how we've been in just the last couple of years framing the actions that we've been taking here in Guam. We are connecting now to the sustainability at a global level with local impact. So sustainability used to be a fringe idea years ago, but now it is actually the centerpiece of international accords, as all 193 member nations or members of the United Nations have adopted the interdisciplinary 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, with goals like zero hunger and no poverty up front. You don't get to the environmental goals until 13, 14, and 15, climate action, life below water, and life on land. But we had an opportunity in 2019 to show up to the UN General Assembly in New York and to be part of an island network that's advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals in locally and culturally relevant ways. So Victoria's colleagues over there in Hawaii have been very helpful at Hawaii Green Growth to help us get into this network with other islands like Seychelles, Curacao, Hawaii, and also big islands like Ireland are part of this movement, taking local action to make global impact on these goals. So after we made this commitment at the UN General Assembly in 2019, thanks to we had to be the highest levels of our government to say yes to the principles of the Local 2030 Islands Network. So our governor and lieutenant governor have said yes to these principles. And we went back home, and the governor appointed over 100 members of all to a working group, 100 members representing all sectors of our society, from government, academia, business, nonprofits. And we got to work creating goals associated with all of the sustainable development goals to implement them in locally and culturally effective ways. And our Center for Island Sustainability at the University of Guam was assigned to facilitate this whole process. So the governor and our UOG president are the co-chairs of the overall process, and I co-chair the steering committee with our Lieutenant Governor Tenorio. And we created, after a few months, we did it. We started right before the pandemic and finished in September of 2020, the first version of the G3 Action Framework, which has hundreds of different goals and action items, moving us forward to create a sustainable future for our island. And so now this Guam Green Growth Initiative is the most comprehensive public-private partnership that we have to create that future. So that's what's driving everything forward. And I just wanted to share tonight a few of the implementation projects that we have underway that's building up our environmental and climate innovations. Number 13, climate action, is something that permeates all of the different goals in our categories of action to create that sustainable future. So we're doing things In food security, for example, we import over 90% of all the food and goods that we consume. So we started opening Guam Green Growth community gardens where we are in public places and we work with our AmeriCorps programs to make sure that these areas are well staffed and growing food that go to those in the community that are in need. And there's also lots of training that happens on a weekly basis, farming and gardening workshops where we're engaging the community, and these are serving as beacons of hope for food security. And it's sparking a really nice movement to grow more local food. So we have two of the gardens that were just established in the last few months, and we are also rolling out aquaponic systems into 5 of our villages to serve as training sites for people to put more of these systems in their backyards. Mostly tilapia for now. We also have some catfish options coming, some aquaculture in Guam, also related to disease-free shrimp is something that we offer from the University of Guam. So we're really excited to be getting these initiatives out into the community on the village level. Another area that we're working on is workforce development. We created the Guam Green Growth Conservation Corps last year, and we finished up with our first cohort of 12 members who are getting workforce training to prepare for the emerging green economy. So in activities such as agriculture, they've been on farms, they've done watershed restoration work, planting over 3,000 trees in different watersheds. They've learned other agricultural practices like beekeeping. They've installed over 641 solar panels and learned about energy efficiency, different techniques. And there was also a lot of island beautification work like trash cleanup and recycling. They recycled over 70,000 aluminum cans, and the redemption fees went back into our local public schools. So we had them in the full-time 5-month program. They graduated, and we're excited on Monday of next week to launch cohort 2, where we'll have the next 12 members working 5 months full-time on all of these different areas. Another area that we're working on is the circular economy. We, as I mentioned, import over 90% of our goods and food, and we dig holes in the ground and fill them with trash. And that's basically our waste management strategy. And we're going to run out of space on our small island one of these days. So we are encouraging the island to shift from this linear economic model, where we take something out of the earth, we make something out of it, we use it, then we throw it away. We need to bend that into a loop, into the circular economy, where we design out waste and pollution, we keep our materials in use, and regenerate natural systems. And how can we do this in a tangible way on the island, which actually gives people an ownership role in creating the circular economy? We opened up just last month the G3 Circular Economy Makerspace and Innovation Hub. There are power tools, CNC routers, laser cutters, power tools to make a whole variety of products. We have precious plastic machines where you can take, we can bring in discarded plastics, discarded metals, discarded lumber, and turn them into new marketable products. So that's the whole purpose of the Circular Economy Makerspace and Innovation Hub, to have access to these tools. It sort of serves like a gym. You pay a membership to go in every month, create things, and we have a demonstration store where our members can sell products on consignment and test them out. And we have business development resources from our Small Business Development Center and Guam Economic Development Authority. And we will help these these entrepreneurs to get successful and to help stimulate green economic industries on our island. Then we also have some innovations in our Thriving Natural Resources category. We have a watershed restoration work to improve the health of our coral reefs, essentially, that are starting to look like this, where sediment is running into the ocean because of poor land use practices. We are working up hill in the watersheds and engaging our community to do things like plant trees and install sediment devices in eroding badlands like this. We put in our treatments, and we can walk away, and a few months later, we can have healthier forests and healthier watersheds. And the latest thing that we are working on now, because it takes a very long time to hike trees up to the top of a mountain, we are now employing drone technology to disperse seeds a lot quicker so we can get the reforestation done within our lifetimes. And I just wanted to share, if you want to take a look at some of these activities, please visit our guamgreengrowth.org website. We're tracking progress on all of these goals on an open, public, and transparent dashboard. This is one of the things that we commit to as part of the Local 2030 Islands Network. Hawaii Green Growth has helped us establish our own G3 dashboard. And so you can take a look and see how we're doing. And we'd love to help other islands interested in going through this model as well. So thank you very much for giving me the time to share what we're working on here in Guam.
Thank you so much, Dr. Austin Shelton. I appreciate you taking some time out this busy whirlwind visit to DC to be with us this evening. It's well appreciated. And I'm also glad you mentioned circular economy issues, the eco-entrepreneurship projects that you're doing, and these bringing sort of the sustainability discussion to the table. And again, I admire sort of the local action to global impact approach, and the potential for many of these local actions to be scaled and replicated, not just in Guam, but of course across, and not just the Pacific, but across even, as you mentioned, sort of even the Caribbean and many other regions. So well taken, Austin. And I know you have to leave early, but we value you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Appreciate it.
Moving on to our next speaker, we have our very own esteemed Professor Jules Bruck from the University of Delaware. She's professor and director of our landscape architecture department. And I'm going to try not to preempt Jules on her talk, but we're talking here about creative approaches, innovative approaches, technologies, methods to move us into sustainable pathways, into climate resilience, and so on. And every time I see Jules's presentations on the planning work that she does, especially in the coastal areas, I am always fascinated, as well as sort of the excitement of our students in looking at the tangible tools and approaches that Professor Bruck brings to the table in terms of coastal resilience, climate resilience, local planning, and so on. So I thought it would be wonderful. I always think, will it be possible for us to take some of her innovative approaches to our island communities? And we have a lot of island practitioners and policy analysts in the audience today. So I'm hoping that they will take note of that. So with that, Professor Jules Bruck. Jules?
Thank you so much, Kaleem. I will just share my screen. So hopefully everyone can see this momentarily. This has been such a great talk, and I think our panel discussion and the keynote was so fantastic. I'm just thrilled to be a part of this. Kaleem, thank you for inviting me. I hope everyone can see this okay. I wanted to talk about the Coastal Resilience Design Studio and how we are addressing coastal hazards through nature-based design. And let's just see if I can click through this. Okay, yep. So just to put this in some context, I am working primarily out of the University of Delaware. As you could see from the very first slide, our work is funded. All the projects I'm going to talk about today have been funded in some way, shape, or form by Delaware Sea Grant. I think the Sea Grant programs are wonderful supporters of both community engagement and research related to coastal communities. So I've been very fortunate to partner with them in many ways. Of course, we're in Delaware, which is a mid-Atlantic state. Mid-Atlantic region is the second highest region in the continental US that is being impacted by sea level rise caused by warming temperatures and also land subsidence. So we have a lot of specific issues specific to Delaware, primarily because we are a very low-lying state in the Mid-Atlantic region. In fact, we are, I believe, the lowest lying state at a median or a mean elevation of 60 feet. And I love this map. It's a little terrifying because you can see a good portion of the east part of our state, which is in the Delaware watershed, Delaware Bay watershed, is quite low lying, 0 to 5 feet, 6 to 10 feet. And these are the places where I'm working. And even in this region, in the southern part of our state, which is draining into the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we have another good chunk of our land mass that is extremely low lying. So we are threatened by this, and our coastal communities are feeling it. And we are responding to that as best we can. And I'll tell you about CRDS so you can understand how we're choosing to respond to this. We are seeing a lot more flooded infrastructure and trying to help communities deal with the impacts from both high tide flooding, intensifying storms, sunny day flooding, beach erosion, and overall shoreline erosion. These are just some of the things that we're working on. But I think it was really interesting to hear Dr. Pulwarty's talk and talk about the complexities of this. And what we try to do at CRDS is not just study the green infrastructure or the infrastructure issues, the sea level rise issues that coastal communities are having problems with, but we're also trying to understand the other resilience issues that they might be facing. So if they have flooded roads, then they can't necessarily get to work or the grocery store as easily. The vulnerabilities are very complex. And when we go into communities, what we find is that they often say to us, you're here to fix our flooding issues, but we have a lot of other issues. We don't have access to food in our community. We don't have jobs in our community. And so our coastal studio takes on social and economic and environmental issues related to coastal communities, particularly those that are the most in need in our community, in our state. So the way we do this is that we bring together student teams and we focus on Coastal Challenge in Delaware, but we also work in other places from time to time so that when we have an opportunity so that we can learn from other places. And that's the project I'm going to present today, where we studied a project in Hampton, Virginia, which is a little further south than us, but experiencing very much the same issues, and we can bring our solutions back to Delaware. So we're always trying to, my point being, we'd love to collaborate with places that have similar issues. And the Coastal Studio is comprised of primarily undergraduate students studying landscape architecture and civil engineering. We also employ environmental science and environmental policy students. And so all of these students work typically, when possible, under the direction or mentorship of a graduate student, and then of course faculty. And we actually go into communities and we talk to them about what their needs are. As you can see here, our students work they like to be outside, they like to be in communities, they like to be talking to people. And again, they develop different levels of plans, even though we might be there to solve a flooding issue. There's persistent issues in all these communities that we always address and therefore present a multifaceted design solution. And we are really interested in policy and moving the dial on policy. And we've had local successes in getting local land use codes updated. And we are really hoping to do more of that in the future. Our deliverables are documents that show all of our research. And the way that the students work is, again, under the advisorship or mentorship of faculty and grad students, but also we have technical advisors, researchers, professionals, professional engineers, and landscape architects, and agency members as well. DelDOT, our Department of Transportation, and our Delaware Natural Resources, they all help the students by attending their reviews and giving them feedback and advice. So we actually deliver very feasible plans at no cost to these low-income communities that we work in, which is very exciting. So I want to quickly talk about one research project. So there is a research component to CRDS and a community engagement component as well. I'm going to go quickly through this in the interest of time, but we do have a project where we were researching living shoreline opportunities in one of our local islands, which is in the Delaware River. This is a really interesting place to work. It has great historic value. It has an old fort and a very significant heronry that is home to 9 different species of herons and ibis and really beautiful birds that are just phenomenal to be anywhere near. It's along a major shipping route in the Delaware River, and we worked here for several reasons, but primarily because of the interesting, it's an interesting case study, and we also have good relationships with the local the folks who run this as a park, and we were certain that we would have security of our sensors. So here's some images you can see, and again, I'm going to try and go through these very quickly, but some of the issues that we see on this island are from ship wake that are coming from the ships that are going up and down, but also just the tides, the more intense storms that we get in particular are causing a lot of erosion. And this is threatening particularly the heronry. So we worked out here where you can see it says site 1, but we studied different sites where we could potentially try living shoreline technology just to see if in this higher energy environment, could any level of purely natural materials be helpful to protect the shoreline. The 3 different sites that we assessed, we did so after looking at sea level rise projections. And here you can see 3 different levels of sea level rise. So this is a very threatened little patch in the middle of the Delaware River. The safest part really is the fort that was built up with fill and is protected by a bulkhead. And the most threatened part is the wetland area on the southern side of the island. But we chose to work to protect the heronry if possible, because we're very interested in that site. So site 1 was the area that we ultimately chose. And we did this using a feasibility model that was developed by the Partnership for Delaware Estuary. It hasn't been published yet. We were actually beta testing it on their behalf. It gave our students an opportunity to look at all the physical characteristics that would be impacting the shoreline, and potentially being able to tell us in the end whether or not a living shoreline, a purely natural living shoreline would be feasible, or does this require a hybrid solution that would have some natural-based materials, but also, in addition to that, some structural materials, or does it really just need a bulkhead or some physical solution? So they looked at physical, biological factors and did inventories of a variety of different things related to that, as well as access to the site and outreach, because community acceptance of implementation like a living shoreline is important for its ultimate upkeep. The feasibilities came out roughly even, but different. This model helped us determine where the best places to work would be. And we've used this model for future determination of where we are able to put either a purely living shoreline or a nature-based shoreline or a hybrid shoreline. So here's just some images that you can see. of our installation of natural materials. This was pilot testing some different ideas we had after reviewing the literature to see if we could bundle sticks or work with core logs or oyster bags to change the way that sediment is trapped and therefore rebuild a bit of the marsh on this side. You can see our sensors on the pilot and how the tides come in and out and affect our materials. In fact, our bundles of sticks just completely washed away. So we learned a lot from our pilot. And we learned also that the ship wake is pretty intense on the side that we were working at, site 1. So we had a lot of work to do to get this more stable and secure. This is the image of our ultimate layout. We used a T formation of groins that was, again, from a literature review, we determined this would be the best way to trap sediment and therefore be able to build up some of the nature-based vegetation along the shoreline. We did install a live stream camera, so that was really wonderful, so we could see how this was working. And here's our students doing the final installation with the plants and the core logs, bundling them up, securing them very tightly. And then we put the sensors in. These are both wave velocity sensors and pressure sensors, so we could understand how these structures were impacted by regular waves, ship wake, and storms. And what we learned was that we did have some decreases of elevation directly behind the T's, some gains of elevation for the landward, which is what we were looking for. And then there were certain areas where there was more and less erosion based on the structures themselves. And we did see that these structures, no matter, even though they were very minimal and nature-based, they did allow for a decrease of energy flux in certain cases. So we were very excited about that. And here you can see our live cam monitoring. So here's just an interpretation of that, some positive buildup of sedimentation, some negative scouring and additional erosion. Which is helpful for us as we're finishing this study. We can redesign a new way of configuring these so we could get better, perhaps better outcomes the next time we are able to do this type of large installation. I just wanted to share some of the camera footage. The camera's been up for over a year. The testing that we did with the sensors was done over the past summertime in 2021. But it's really fascinating to see the structures over the course of the winter. As a designer, I'm fascinated by this. And in the summer, the herons are out and you can see them enjoying these groins as a resting place. So I think I have time to very quickly review one other project. This is the project that we worked on in Hampton, Virginia. It's called Carbon in the Tidewater. This was an award-winning project that was part of the surf competition. We won first place with this entry, which focused on resilient self-generative infrastructure. So we're trying really hard in the Coastal Studio to really break boundaries and be incredibly innovative. We're talking about using different levels of dredge material to create barrier islands, and even doing crazy things like 3D printing barrier reefs that would become oyster habitat. The students do a great job of trying to assess human risk in situations like this and ecological risks. And of course, lots of different levels of GIS-based analysis. But we also went to the site and visited the people and talked to them about their concerns and their needs. And we learned their stories of having to sometimes tie up a kayak to the front door when they know that the tides are going to come in at a certain moon phase and they're going to be flooded out. And so they move their car to high ground and take the kayak to the car when they need to leave their house. One of our concerns is how will you pay for expensive, large nature-based infrastructure like this barrier island? And so the students worked really hard to understand the carbon market and think about how many tons of carbon could be sequestered by these different infrastructure treatments, what would be the ecological value of these restorations, so that we could propose that you could pay for a portion of this through trading on the carbon market. And I'll just put through these slides very quickly so you can see some of the things that they did, including a breakwater that was also sequestering a lot of carbon and provided oyster habitat potential, therefore good water quality. And the breakwater was protective for the community. It didn't completely stop the storm surge from hitting the community, but it greatly reduced the wave energy. And they also looked at different levels of aquatic vegetation, submerged aquatic vegetation that could protect water quality and also be more of a resilience barrier. And all of these were completely quantified so that we could understand deeply how these would perhaps get paid for, which was a huge part of the project. So the last portion of this project, which I think is really amazing, is the addition of carbon gardens to these areas in Hampton. And what that did, it allowed the community to get involved. So if the whole community buys into this idea that we can sequester carbon and make our place more resilient, our home more resilient, through large infrastructure projects, but also through things that we can do in our own yards to sequester more carbon using C4 photosynthesis plants. That was one of the bigger successes of this project as well. And it gets to the point of the different levels of ways that we can start to address issues related to sea level rise and climate change along coastal environments. So thank you so much. I went through that very quickly, but I think I stayed roughly within my time limit. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Professor Bruck. I learn something new every time I hear you speak. Carbon gardens.
Carbon gardens, they're the new rage. I'm gonna make them a thing.
There you go. Sure, you can do it. And this talk also reminds us of our domestic islands, barrier islands, estuarine islands, like the project you mentioned. If we really think about it, I mean, Alaska alone has over 2,000 islands as well, and clearly we have work to do there as well in those kinds of geographies. Thank you very much, and we move on now. We're moving over time, but I appreciate you staying with us. We move to our final panelist, who is Dr. Peter Edwards, and Peter is a conservation officer at the Pew Charitable Trusts. He's here in DC, and I'm very, very happy to say one of our distinguished UD graduates, PhD graduates, and very happy to have him here again to give some contribution and a perspective from the environmental work, marine work that he does, and the perspective of the Pew Charitable Trust on these issues. So with that, Dr. Peter Edwards. Peter?
Good afternoon and good night and good morning, folks. It's hard to follow such a great lineup, but I'm going to do my best. And I think I am a bookend to a very interesting and very informative presentation. And I trust that my children upstairs won't be making too much noise. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as I try to quickly wrap up what I heard from the discussion and provide some overarching thoughts. See if I'm sharing correctly here. Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right. I think my screen is everybody seeing the correct screen?
Yes, that's great, Peter. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So I just wanted to start by again thanking you, Kelly, for this invitation, and again a nod to the University of Delaware, but I also feel in very good company. I think I have some connection, perhaps the most of the panelists. Also, my undergraduate and master's degrees were from University of the West Indies in Jamaica. I worked, my previous job before coming here at Pew was at NOAA, in particular NOAA's Coral Conservation Program, where I spent the last 7 years of my time at NOAA, working on U.S. U.S. Territories, U.S. coral reef territories. So very familiar with some of the work that some of the colleagues before presented. So I'm just going to try and quickly talk about, so just some thoughts. Generally, I don't necessarily have any case studies to go through, but just to speak about what I think, wrapping up this discussion about how to make policy truly innovative. One of the things I, kind of feel is an important theoretical underpinning is that we need to make these socio-ecological linkages, which I think all of our speakers today have referenced. And in particular, if we're thinking about this in a climate context, one of the key things, certainly as an environmental economist or somebody who has a bit of training in that area, is the importance of internalizing the cost of the negative externalities associated with climate. And because climate is such a kind of globally dispersed problem, some of these costs fall disproportionately on small islands, including tropical small island states, of which we spent a lot of time talking about today. So this is really just an expose of just thinking through at a very high level of what are some of the innovative policy tools that we can think about or continue to think about that can offer solutions to island states and territories. Okay, let's see if I can advance the slide. So, one of, again, this is perhaps my own bias, is the focus and emphasis on, these socio-ecological approaches to conservation and management. I think it's important, and again, many of the presentations today made that link. Roger set us up very well with some impacts of extreme events. Victoria spoke about, in her example, she referenced issues of health costs and like policy triggers like water security and so on. Austin spent a lot of time talking about food security and its linkages to climate. And Jules, of course, speaking about coastal resilience as well. So I think all of the speakers here again are obviously connecting the social and ecological and biophysical issues associated with climate change and its impact on islands. So as my slide here suggests, this requires, and Kalim, I think you mentioned it as well, this real focus on interdisciplinary approaches and real kind of equal integrated. Sometimes we have this idea of like bringing in the social scientists last to talk about communications. We're really talking about robust approaches being combined and working together to address these problems. Because essentially what we're doing is we're trying to identify these complex patterns and relationships between these kind of big processes and how they impact people and how people are impacting those people. And a lot of this is tied to ecosystem outcomes linked to human well-being outcomes. So just quickly kind of like shifting here to look at, a quick example of, like science and innovation and how it's impacting people. This is a paper that I collaborated on with a bunch of folks recently. And the reason for focusing on this diagram is to just highlight, it's an example of how, using advanced science and policy applications can be used to potentially address SIDS climate change challenges. This diagrammatic that we have here, looks at some of the more, ocean acidification, elevated sea level rise, cyclones, measuring it, assessing it, and how those things feed into, in our example here, we looked at coral reefs, and then the flows to fisheries, the impact to reef structure, and actually how that impacts lives and property. So, everything that folks have been discussing here today, this diagrammatic, it really encapsulates this merger of, biophysical and hydrodynamic studies and how that's linked with human impacts. And so therefore, what are the policy tools? What are the innovative technological and policy solutions that can help us to address these things? And as I mentioned before, including accounting for the costs and benefits of action or inaction. So this is just another kind of very localized management scenario. It's a schematic. It's not necessarily drawn from a particular example, but again, here, this infusion of linking social sciences and economic sciences to an island coastal zone management case with a focus on coral reefs in this instance. And this, again, the schematic describes the different points at which, economics and biophysical sciences kind of overlap. We're looking here at, like damage from a storm that is linked to, degradation of the reef. You can have modeling and measurement of these systems to help you predict impacts and so on. Very simple things like the width of your beach, that's linked very significantly to the economic value of property and tourism potential. So again, this diagram here just really kind of emphasizes that everything is connected and why it's important to take this interdisciplinary innovative approach to addressing climate change impacts. So again, I just have one more slide. I promise I'll be very quick to allow for a more fulsome discussion and catch up back with some time. This slide here really just kind of explores these other innovative applications. Many of your guests, as well as panelists, are very aware of these issues. If we're talking about climate, a key innovative application really is thinking about what's the true and appropriate price of carbon, which leverages a whole bunch of other policy solutions also indicated here. The recent IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report really helps us, think more critically about the role of markets and how that can play. But what is needed is that the IPCC models and other global models out there need to be updated and also linked to the socioeconomic costs. And some of this will feed into the conversations around loss and damage. And I know, not only US islands, but several kind of developing small island states are really tip of the spear on those conversations. There has been a growing interest in coastal blue carbon, and the example that was just given about students' project on trying to link carbon credits. So again, this is linked to improvements in modeling. The work on voluntary carbon credits really needs to be supported by innovative technology for monitoring and validation if you're going to be offering high credits and guaranteeing permanence. And measuring additionality and so on that. So all of these things are linked to the science and the technological approach, linking with economics and people. Innovative nature-based solutions. Again, we had some examples here today. Again, I need to kind of remind our audience and our guests that while nature-based solutions play a relatively small, if you think comparatively to the big issue of carbon dioxide in air and the fact that we really need to cut emissions in several other ways, nature-based solutions play a role, but they shouldn't be overemphasized as the solution to climate change mitigation, but they're very important. And in particular, because they can have very significant co-benefits beyond carbon sequestration to vulnerable communities. Some of the coastal protection that we've talked about, habitat and nursery protection provision services to support food security. So very important, again, to think about the kind of ecological as well as how these connect to humans and people. There's also, exploration and, in many instances in the terrestrial world, examples of blue and green bonds, and more and more, there are discussions and explorations on how this could be applied in the coastal and island space. There have been a couple bonds floated out there supported by the insurance industry. But again, more work needs to be done to fine-tune the modeling that will be linked to the actuarial solutions to provide, to provide, investment opportunities for folks as well as provide, ecosystem benefits to people. In some areas, people are also looking at biodiversity bonds, blue bonds, with some mixed success. People have tried work in tuna in the Pacific as well. But again, all of these innovative applications really need better integration and again, continuing to really not give lip service, but really truly integrate science and policy. Many of these are, I also have the reminder here that some of these may require tailor-made or bespoke approaches to, particularly small islands in the context and small island US territories, if you want to get more specific. Since one size may not fit all, there may be cultural differences on the Atlantic Caribbean with USVI and Puerto Rico, as opposed to in the Pacific Islands, which, there are differences across these places. So these solutions may require to be tailor-made. We also need to obviously be sensitive about what we mean when we talk about innovation. Innovation, and I think most of the speakers here today have expressed that in some of their presentations. It's not necessarily only technological solutions, but a broad variety of social and other aspects of innovation, including policy tools. And we should be mindful that we should draw from our indigenous innovation. And I use that term intentionally because some of these innovative approaches that we seem to be exploring today maybe centuries old. So again, we need to step back and think about what that is meant. And finally, I guess I'd add is really we need to focus on this genuine interdisciplinary approaches to addressing these policy solutions, including peer-to-peer and island-to-island learning, I think, which will help move us along in this issue of sustainability. So I think that is the end of my presentation. Yes. So I think I hopefully have given us back some time to wrap up. So let me stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for your contribution. So again, the environmental economist anchoring us back to the significant issues of the day and the role of technology and innovation, but also tempered by sociocultural aspects as well as the finance aspects that we keep coming back to. And definitely, yes, there's more attention to the blue credits, the blue and green bonds, and so on, as we especially see that emerging in the academic literature as well. And we're really looking for those what we might call win-win situations, and we refer to as those kinds of solutions that produce co-benefits, right? That's sort of the strategic name of the game right now, sort of in this situation, urgent situation that we are in. And lastly, your point about one size doesn't fit all, well taken. And even in the earlier sessions today on energy and economic recovery, we also see that that thread ringing true. So again, here in this context, that also is well received. And so with that, I will give the closing remarks to our keynote, Dr. Roger Pulwarty, who will give us his final thoughts on the panel and take us home. All right, Roger?
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. I mean, this is always extremely insightful. We learn a whole lot. As I like to say, one of my mentors always was fond of saying, if we know so much, why aren't we doing better? And so I think there's a lot of richness. I do want to say one thing that is completely self-serving, which is you will notice that many of the speakers are related to Noah in one way or the other. And we'll get Austin too. And the idea here is to give what you heard from Peter, what you heard from Victoria, and others, definitely Jules and Austin, that the evolution in thought is actually thinking through how the public funding in science and innovation actually benefits down to the last mile into local communities. We need to be very clear, as Peter pointed out, that yes, there are things like resilience bonds, very, very innovative, but we need to understand the public-private interface. It's not simply the transfer of goods and services to the private sector, nor is it simply underwriting government programs. So that partnership needs to be very well constructed. As Victoria knows, and we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow, when Claudia Nirenberg and myself were developing what became the RISA program, we put interdisciplinary sciences in the title deliberately to simply not make it static assessments that were not constantly informed by multiple disciplines. From the standpoint of what you heard, very rich notion from Austin, something I want to really learn from him. We're part of Local 2030. I want to really learn, how some of the local initiatives are being scaled up in the way you asked, Callum. And I think that is very, very rich. Yeah, I know that, well, they're trying to change it, but that's not happening. But the idea is really that scaling up requires a set of activities and supporting functions that that we might want to investigate closer. I think there's a lot of innovation in there. We're trying to do something similar with the folks in the music industry, entertainers, and so on. I didn't have time to talk about it in the Caribbean on getting them behind local efforts, especially youth related. And it's wonderful to see the actual realization of nature-based inputs that are rigorously tested in the way Jules is doing. So we've heard some very rich threads, and it's common for us to say, wow, this is all wonderful, what I said, what Victoria says, what Austin said, Peter and Jules. But I think one of the things that the academic environment can help us do is really not just test our ideas and, like I said, develop a new cadre of people, but create that space, as we tried to do with things like Greases and so on, in which the public, private, civil society and communications and communities work out where we want to go. Not simply the delivery of information, not simply user-driven, but what are the choices? The modern view that, co-production has come to mean, give me some of your data and we'll write a paper together, when it really originated from how does the interaction of academia, public, private, civil society co-produce a sustainable future? And what we're seeing are many of the tools, processes, and insights in how we might move that forward. I want to give Peter a shout out for highlighting, and I pointed to some of this in the case in Dominica, that these are all conditioned to some extent on making the choice up front. But there's a richer notion in there to spend that money up front, which is we can do so in ways that do not diminish our sense of well-being, if our sense of well-being is not simply about accumulation. So I want to thank the entire panel and you, Callum, and Pravish, of course, for having us on and for giving the opportunity to learn. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you very much, Roger. And thank you to the panel for this excellent discussion, the audience who's pretty much stayed with us even over time. One final house note, we will have tomorrow in our program from 1 p.m. Eastern to 3:30 p.m. Eastern, our strategic planning brainstorming session on how we might develop a knowledge platform that would serve the objectives that we've all spoken about here, especially in U.S. island territories. And Roger and Victoria will join us, at least for the beginning part of that, to set the stage. And we welcome everyone to join us tomorrow as well. With that, thank you very much, and we've come to an end. Thank you very much. Take care. Be safe.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers.